Imagine this for a second. Your bank app still opens. Your account balance still shows numbers, but outside, none of it works anymore. Shops won't accept your money. ATMs are empty, and the one thing everyone told you would save you, gold, sits useless in your pocket. That moment has already happened, multiple times, in different countries, to people who thought they were prepared. And that's the lie we're going to expose today. Because when economies actually collapse, not in theory, not in YouTube comments, but in documented reality, gold does not save people. Something else does. Let me take you to a city under siege. Early 1990s, Europe. A once normal neighborhood. Electricity gone, water gone, food gone. A former banker knocks on his neighbor's door. He's holding a gold necklace, real gold, worth months of salary in the old world. He's not asking for food, not medicine. He's asking for cigarettes and lighters. Why? Because in a world without infrastructure, gold doesn't cook food. Gold doesn't boil water. Gold doesn't keep your children warm at night. Fire does. This wasn't a story passed down or exaggerated over time. It was documented day by day by a man who survived more than a year inside total economic collapse. And what he witnessed should make anyone holding hard assets deeply uncomfortable. He watched people with gold starve, while people with skills, tools, and community survived. Here's the part nobody wants to admit. Most financial advice is built for normal times, markets functioning, rule of law intact, institutions operating. But #economic collapse doesn't announce itself politely. It moves fast, it breaks trust, and it revalues overnight. When money dies, societies don't become futuristic, they go backward. Barter replaces currency. Utility replaces price. Survival replaces status. And in that world, the most valuable assets aren't shiny or rare. They're useful. In this video, I'm going to prove, using Bosnia, Venezuela, the Great Depression, and real economic data, why a $1,000 investment in the right skills and practical goods can keep a family alive, while $10,000 in gold can leave you helpless. This isn't anti-gold, it's anti-illusion. Because collapse doesn't care what worked on paper, it only rewards what works in practice. And by the end of this breakdown, you'll understand why some communities quietly survive every crisis, while others line up with money that no longer means anything. Next, we're going to look at the first pattern that appears in every collapse, and why almost everyone underestimates how fast it happens. Here's the first mistake almost everyone makes. They assume collapse is slow. They imagine years of warnings, gradual decline, time to adjust the portfolio. That's not how this works. In every documented case of true economic collapse, the switch flips fast. Months, sometimes weeks, sometimes days. Bosnia learned this the hard way. At first, people still trusted money. They tried to live normally. They told themselves, this will stabilize. It didn't. Prices didn't rise gradually, they exploded. A pack of cigarettes that cost the equivalent of 1 unit of currency outside the war zone suddenly cost 20, 30, 100 times more inside. Not because cigarettes became luxury items, because currency was dying in real time. And here's the detail that should terrify anyone with savings sitting still. There was a short window, brief and deceptive, where money still kind of worked. Then suddenly, it didn't work at all. And when that trust broke, it never came back. We saw the same pattern decades later in Venezuela. Inflation didn't crawl, it detonated. Over 1,000,000%. Money became so useless people gave it a nickname, the dead currency. But the most chilling part wasn't inflation, it was what came next. The government announced certain bills were no longer legal tender. Citizens were given 72 hours to exchange their life savings. 3 days. Imagine waking up to find out your money has an expiration date. Miss it, and your savings become paper. Argentina followed the same script. Late 1990s into early 2000s. Banks froze accounts. Withdrawals were limited. Currency controls locked people out of their own money. By the time the public fully understood what was happening, it was already over. This is the critical insight most investors never internalize. Currency collapse isn't linear, it's exponential. At first, denial, then panic, then improvisation. And when currency fails, something ancient takes its place: barter. Not because people romanticize it, but because it's the only thing left. In Venezuela today, fishermen don't sell fish for money. They trade fish for rice, for plantains, for cooking oil. Farmers walk hundreds of kilometers carrying bananas, cassava, and yams, not to sell, but to exchange. In some regions, coffee beans became currency, not officially, organically. Why? Because they're standardized, consumable, useful. This is economic reversion. When modern systems fail, societies snap back to pre-industrial logic. And here's the uncomfortable truth. In that world, gold doesn't solve immediate problems. You can't eat it, you can't drink it, you can't fix a broken pump with it. But the person who can produce food, the person who can repair, the person who can preserve, they don't wait for recovery. They survive the collapse itself. And once you see this pattern clearly, another question becomes unavoidable. If currency dies fast and barter rewards utility, what assets actually carry people through the worst phase? That answer comes from an era most people misunderstand, and it destroys one of the most persistent myths in investing.
Most people remember the Great Depression as a story about money. Stocks crashed, banks failed, jobs disappeared. That's incomplete. The real divide wasn't rich versus poor. It was productive versus non-productive. And that distinction decided who ate and who didn't. When the Depression hit, farmers were devastated on paper. Crop prices collapsed so badly some burned corn for fuel because coal cost more. But here's the part history books gloss over. Farm families didn't starve. They adapted. They planted massive gardens. They canned vegetables and fruit. They produced milk, eggs, and meat. They baked bread from flour bought in bulk. Cash income dropped to near zero. Survival didn't. Urban families told a different story. Factory towns lost thousands of jobs. Wages fell 30% or more if you were lucky enough to keep a job. And without land, without tools, without skills, money was the only thing standing between them and hunger. When that money vanished, so did their security. One comment I read under a previous video summed it up perfectly. My grandfather survived the Great Depression because he had 4 acres, carpentry skills, and could fix things, not because he had savings. That pattern wasn't rare, it was common. And then something even more revealing happened during World War II. 20 million Americans planted victory gardens, not as a hobby, not for patriotism, out of necessity. By 1943, those gardens produced 10 billion pounds of food, about 40% of the entire U.S. vegetable supply. Let that sink in. Almost half the nation's vegetables came from backyards, balconies, empty lots, urban spaces. This wasn't ideology, it was math. Land produces value regardless of markets, and the data proves it. During the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the S&P 500 collapsed nearly 50%. Farmland? It rose in value. Not speculation, insurance. From 1992 to 2020, farmland showed lower volatility than stocks, and even lower volatility than gold. Because land produces something real: food, rent, security. And once you understand that, another realization hits hard. You don't need a massive farm to benefit from this principle. You need productive capacity, the ability to create something people need when systems fail. Which leads us to the most undervalued asset in any collapse: skills. Because skills don't sit in vaults, they don't rely on markets, and they can't be frozen by a bank. In the next part, we're going to examine which skills quietly became survival currency and why they outperformed every financial asset when it mattered most. Here's where the story stops being abstract. Because when collapse strips away money, status, and titles, one thing becomes brutally clear. What can you actually do? During the Great Depression, survival didn't come from clever investments. It came from production. People didn't find jobs, they created value. They caught and sold fish, they grew berries and traded them. They butchered animals and preserved meat. They baked bread from flour bought in bulk. Cash income dropped to near zero. Survival didn't. Notice the pattern. Every successful strategy solved a physical human need: food, clothing, shelter, health. These weren't hobbies, they were currencies. A person who could smoke meat or can vegetables could trade indefinitely. A carpenter could exchange repairs for food. A mechanic could turn scrap into mobility. And some professions never stopped being valuable at all. Doctors, nurses, dentists. Even when money was unreliable, people found ways to compensate them with goods, services, protection, and food. Here's the critical distinction gold advocates miss. Gold is static. It sits. It waits. A skill is dynamic. It produces. It adapts. It travels with you. You can steal gold from someone. You cannot steal the fact that a person knows how to rebuild an engine, treat an infection, or grow food in poor soil. That's why skills became survival capital. But this goes even deeper. Because when collapse becomes violent or prolonged, security changes the rules of value. This is where first-hand testimony matters. Inside total breakdown, certain items rose to the top of the barter hierarchy: ammunition, medicine, hygiene supplies. But here's the twist. One of the most valuable items wasn't a weapon. It wasn't fuel. It wasn't technology. It was something small, cheap, silent. Lighters. Thousands of them. Why? Because fire is non-negotiable. Cooking, heating, purifying water. A generator makes noise, needs fuel, attracts attention. Lighters don't. They're portable, distributable, replaceable. Lose a few, no catastrophe. And in a world where theft is constant, that redundancy is everything. The man who survived that siege learned this the hard way. He traded filled lighters for food, for candles, for medicine. Gold? It traded at the value of a can of soup if you were lucky. Warlords understood something most investors don't. Gold only matters after stability returns. During the collapse itself, it's dead weight. And if that sounds extreme, remember, this isn't theory, it's documented reality. But the most important asset still hasn't been named. Because even skills and supplies fail without something else backing them up. In the next part, we're going to look at the invisible force that determined who lived longest in collapse, and why isolation is the most dangerous strategy of all.
There's an asset almost no one prepares for. You can't store it in a safe. You can't buy it online. And by the time collapse begins, it's already too late to build. Community. Study after study confirms it. Across nearly 150 meta-analyses, people with strong social ties had a 50% higher survival rate than those without. That's not marginal. That's the difference between living and dying. And this pattern shows up everywhere collapse occurs. In Bosnia, trades rarely happened in public. They happened quietly, through introductions, trust, and reputation. You didn't trade with strangers. You traded with people you already knew. Because desperation changes incentives, and trust becomes the real currency. Those who survived best weren't lone wolves with bunkers. They were nodes inside networks. Neighbors who shared watch duties. Families who pooled food. Groups who coordinated security and information. In Venezuela, entire neighborhoods formed informal barter systems. Food moved where it was needed. Information moved faster than money ever could. People who were isolated, even if they had supplies, were targeted, exploited, or simply overwhelmed. This is why certain communities seem almost immune to collapse. Not because they're wealthy, but because they're integrated. Shared labor, shared norms, shared responsibility. That's what people refer to as the Amish Hedge. Not religion, structure. A diversified survival system. Land, skills, practical goods, mutual aid, trust. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Most modern people have optimized for independence when survival favors interdependence. A single household can be broken. A community is resilient. And once you see that, gold's role becomes painfully clear. Gold doesn't feed neighbors. Gold doesn't patrol streets. Gold doesn't treat injuries. Community does. So when people ask, what's the best hedge against collapse, they're asking the wrong question. The better question is, what makes me valuable to the people around me? Because in collapse, value determines protection. Which brings us to the final reckoning. When you stack all assets side by side, gold, stocks, land, skills, supplies, relationships, which ones actually perform when the system fails? The comparison is brutal. And in the next part, we're going to dismantle gold's last remaining claim as a survival hedge, using nothing but historical data and cold math. This is where the argument finally collapses under its own weight. Because when you compare assets during real breakdowns, gold's reputation doesn't just weaken, it fails. Let's be precise. Gold has one core function: store value across stable systems. That's it. It does not generate food. It does not generate income. It does not solve immediate survival problems. And during collapse, timing is everything. In Bosnia, gold had future value, but near zero present value. People understood gold would matter after the war, after stability, after institutions returned. But during the crisis itself, it was a liability. You couldn't openly trade it without becoming a target. You couldn't break it into small units easily, and no one with food or medicine wanted it unless they already had excess. Meanwhile, productive assets never stopped working. Land produced food whether currencies existed or not. Skills produced services regardless of markets. Tools enabled repair, production, and trade. Now let's talk numbers. During the 2008-2009 financial crisis, S&P 500 minus 46%. Gold dropped initially, then recovered. Farmland plus 17%. Not because farmland was trendy, because it produces cash flow, food, and rent under any regime. From 1992 to 2020, S&P 500 volatility around 17%. Gold volatility around 15%. Farmland volatility under 7%. Farmland didn't just outperform, it was stable. During periods of high inflation, farmland returns averaged more than double inflation itself. Gold, volatile, reactive, sentiment-driven. And this leads to the key misunderstanding. Gold is not collapse insurance. Gold is post-collapse optionality. It helps after a new system forms. But if you rely on it during the breakdown, you're exposed. That's why the historical pattern is so consistent. People with gold suffered through collapse. People with productive capacity survived it. People with both did best, but only if gold came last. And now look around the world. Venezuela, complete collapse, barter economy. Lebanon, banks frozen, currency down 98%. Turkey, accelerating inflation, gold hoarding rising. Argentina, repeating its own history. And then there's the elephant in the room, the United States. 38 trillion in debt, interest payments larger than defense spending, permanent deficits, trillions created since 2008. For the first time in history, every currency on earth is fiat. No anchors, no backing, just confidence. And confidence is fragile. So here's the uncomfortable truth. If multiple major currencies fail together, gold won't save you first. The people who endure will be those who already live partly outside the system. Which brings us to the final question. If gold isn't the foundation and money can disappear, What does a real collapse hedge actually look like? That's where everything comes together. So now we arrive at the only question that actually matters. What do you do before you're forced to? Because collapse doesn't reward panic, it rewards positioning. Across every case we've examined, Bosnia, Venezuela, the Great Depression, modern inflation crises, the survivors weren't guessing. They followed the same framework, quietly, practically, without waiting for permission. This framework is what many call the Amish Hedge, not because it's old-fashioned, but because it works when modern systems don't. It has 5 parts. First, productive land at any scale. Not everyone can buy farmland. That's not the point. A backyard garden, rooftop containers, community plots. Food production isn't about self-sufficiency. It's about leverage. Even small output gives you trade power, skill development, and security. Second, practical demand-proof skills. Gardening, food preservation, carpentry, mechanical repair, basic medical knowledge, plumbing, electrical. These skills can't be frozen, inflated away, or stolen from a bank. They degrade only if you don't use them. Third, practical goods with direct utility. Medicine, hygiene supplies, tools, batteries, lighters, preserved food. These items don't depend on markets to be valuable. They are markets. Fourth, community intentionally built. Know your neighbors, exchange skills, build trust before it's needed. Because in collapse, lone wolves don't look strong. They look like targets. Fifth, and only fifth, precious metals. Gold and silver still have a role, but not as lifeboats, as bridges. They help you move from the end of one system to the beginning of another, only after you've secured survival. This is where many people get it backwards. They stack metal, but have no land, no skills, no network. That's not hedging, that's hoping. History doesn't reward hope. It rewards preparation grounded in reality. And the reality is simple. When money dies, value doesn't disappear. It changes form. Bread replaces bills, skills replace credentials, trust replaces contracts. The people who understand this early don't panic later. They don't stand in line with worthless currency wondering what happened. They're already trading eggs for bread, repairing tools for food, sharing resources inside communities that function regardless of headlines. So the question isn't if systems change. They always do. The question is whether you'll still be useful when they do. If this breakdown gave you a new lens on economic collapse, hyperinflation, and investing, you already know what to do next. Position quietly, build steadily, diversify outside the system before the system forces you to. Because when the price tags stop making sense, the prepared won't need them. If this video changed how you think about money, survival, and real security, subscribe now. This channel doesn't sell hope or hype. We break down economic collapse using real history, real data, and real outcomes. Subscribe so you see the patterns before they reach your life.